They were encircled. Then, Earth's shock troops landed. Part 1. The Siege of Verith Prime. The sky above Verith Prime had not been clear in 11 days. Smoke from burning wreckage drifted across the horizon in thick black ribbons, and the ground shook every few minutes as another Zale bombardment struck somewhere along the outer defense line. Commander Torvon stood at the observation slit of his underground bunker and watched another section of the perimeter wall crumble into dust and twisted metal. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. 11 days ago, the Zale Dominion had arrived in the Verith system with a fleet so large it had blotted out the stars. 300 warships, troop carriers beyond counting, and enough ground forces to bury the planet twice over. They had come for the starport, the last functioning gateway on this side of contested space. And they had come prepared to take it by force. Torvon had been given command of the Coalition garrison 6 months before the attack. 4 species under one flag, Silvani, Droth, Quelari, and Mekari, each with their own way of fighting, their own language, their own pride. He had spent those 6 months turning them into something that resembled a single army. He had drilled them. He had built 3 rings of defensive positions around the starport. He had stockpiled ammunition and food and medical supplies. It had not been enough. The outer ring had fallen on day 3. The Zyle had simply thrown bodies at it until the defenders ran out of things to shoot. The second ring had held until day 7, when the Zyle brought up siege artillery so massive it shook the teeth in your skull from 2 kilometers away. Now the coalition forces were packed into the inner ring, a tight circle around the starport itself, barely 4 kilometers across, and even that was shrinking. Torvon turned from the observation slit and walked through the bunker. It was crowded. Wounded soldiers lay on every flat surface, and the air smelled of blood and antiseptic and fear. A Droth medic worked on a Mekari trooper, whose leg was gone below the knee. The Mekari was not screaming. He had passed that point hours ago, and now simply stared at the ceiling with dull, empty eyes. The medic's hands were steady, but Torvon could see the exhaustion in the way his shoulders sagged. They were out of proper medical supplies. They had been rationing ammunition for 3 days. Food would last maybe another 48 hours if they cut portions again, and there was no way out. The Zale fleet controlled the orbit completely. Nothing was getting in or out of the system. They were surrounded, cut off, and slowly dying. Torvon entered the command center, a cramped room deep in the bunker where tactical displays flickered with bad news. His staff moved around the holographic map of the perimeter, adjusting positions, redirecting what little reserves they had to plug gaps that opened faster than they could be filled. Every face in the room carried the same look. Not panic, something worse. Acceptance. His second in command, a Droth officer named Galen, approached him with a datapad. The numbers on the screen were simple and brutal. They had lost 400 soldiers in the last 24 hours. The Zyle had launched 6 major assaults along the northern wall alone. 2 had nearly broken through. The next one probably would. "We cannot hold another day like yesterday," Galen said quietly, keeping his voice low so the others would not hear. "If they hit us with the same strength tomorrow morning, the northern section will collapse. After that, they will be inside the perimeter." Torvon took the datapad and studied it, though he already knew every number on it. He had been a soldier for 40 years. He had commanded forces in 9 campaigns across 6 star systems. He knew what a losing position looked like. He was standing in one. "Have we received any response to our distress calls?" he asked. Galen shook his head. "The Zale jamming net is too strong. We have been broadcasting on every frequency, but nothing gets through cleanly. Even if someone heard us, the nearest coalition fleet is 12 days away. We do not have 12 days. Torvon set the datapad down and looked at the map. The blue dots representing his forces were clustered in a shrinking circle. The red dots, representing the Zale, surrounded them on every side, thick and endless, like an ocean pressing against a dam that was full of cracks. It was probably pointless, but he had not survived 40 years by giving up before the last shot was fired. "Tell communications to try again," he said. "Use the narrow-band burst frequency. There is a gap in the jamming net along the southern orbital path. It opens for roughly 90 seconds every 4 hours when the Zale patrol ships rotate. We will use that window. Send on every channel. Send to everyone." Galen hesitated. "Commander, even if the signal gets through, who will come? The coalition fleets are too far. The neutral powers will not involve themselves. There is no one close enough to reach us in time." "Send it anyway," Torvan said. 3 levels below the command center, in a small room filled with humming equipment and tangled cables, a young Quillari communications officer named Lise sat at her console and prepared the burst transmission. She was 22 years old, barely out of training, and she had not slept in 2 days. Her hands trembled slightly as she coded the message, but her work was precise. She had always been good with signals. It was the one thing she could still do well while everything else fell apart around her. She watched the clock, waiting for the gap in the jamming net. When it came, she fired the burst, a compressed packet of data screaming outward at the speed of light, carrying a simple message in every major galactic language. Coalition forces under siege, requesting immediate assistance, coordinates attached. She did not expect a reply. No one did. But 40 minutes later, her console beeped. A signal was coming in, faint, buried in static, but real. She cleaned it up, filtered the noise, and ran it through the translator. The language was one she had only seen in databases. It was strange and rough, full of hard consonants and short vowels. The message was brief. "Hold your ground. We are coming." She checked the signal origin 3 times, because she was sure she had made a mistake. But the data was clear. The signal had come from the direction of Sol system. She opened a channel to the command center. Her voice was steady, though her heart was beating fast. "Commander Torvan, we received a reply to our distress call." There was a pause. Then Torvan's voice came through, sharp with surprise. "From whom?" "The signal originates from Sol system, Commander. It is from the humans." Silence filled the command center. Torvan had heard of humans. Most species in the galaxy had, though few had dealt with them directly. They were a young species, barely a century into faster-than-light travel. They had no major alliances, no great fleet, no reputation for military power. The Galactic Intelligence reports described them as recently spacefaring, technologically moderate, diplomatically unremarkable. Galen looked at Torvan with an expression that was hard to read. "The humans," he repeated. "What can they possibly do?" Torvan did not answer immediately. He stared at the tactical display, at the red tide pressing in from every direction, at the dwindling blue dots that represented everything he had left. Then he looked at the message again on Lisa's screen. "Hold your ground. We are coming." Not "we will try," not "we are evaluating the situation." Just a plain, flat statement. They were coming. Torvan did not know what the humans could do. He did not know if they could do anything at all. But someone had answered, and that was more than anyone else in the galaxy had done. "Tell all units to hold their positions," he said. "We are not done yet." They were encircled. Then Earth's shock troops landed. Part 2. The Black Fleet. 48 hours after the message arrived, nothing had changed on the ground, except that things had gotten worse. The Zayal had launched their biggest assault yet, on the second morning. 3 waves of infantry, supported by heavy armor, hit the northern wall at dawn, and for 2 terrible hours the line bent so far inward that Zayal soldiers actually reached the outer buildings of the starport complex. Torvan threw in his last reserve unit, a mixed company of Silvani and Mikari troops who had already been fighting for 10 straight hours, and they pushed the Zael back just far enough to seal the breach. The cost was ugly. 80 more dead, 200 wounded, and the northern wall was now held by soldiers standing in rubble, rather than behind proper fortifications. Galen stopped asking about reinforcements. The look on his face said he had already accepted how this would end. Most of the officers had. They did their jobs with grim efficiency, moving units, counting ammunition, treating wounded, but there was no hope behind their eyes. They were professionals doing professional work while waiting to die. Only Lise kept listening. She sat at her console in the communications room, headphones pressed tight against her skull, scanning every frequency for the signal she had heard 2 days ago. She found nothing but static and Jael military chatter. Sometimes she wondered if she had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the signal had been a ghost, a reflection bouncing off debris in orbit. Maybe there were no humans coming. Maybe no one was coming at all. She kept listening anyway. Far away, at the edge of the Verith system, where the stars were cold and the void was empty, space folded. Faster than light travel left marks, ripples in the fabric of space that sensitive equipment could detect from a great distance. The Jael sensor operators aboard their command ship picked up the disturbance immediately and reported it to Fleet Commander Zalos, who sat in his command chair like a stone idol, cold-eyed and patient. "How many?" Zalos asked. 12 vessels, Fleet Commander, all small. The largest appears to be a light carrier. No vessel exceeds medium cruiser tonnage. Zalos studied the sensor data with the detached interest of a predator watching something too small to be worth eating. His fleet numbered 314 warships, including 8 capital-class dreadnoughts, each one capable of destroying a small moon. The new arrivals were so outnumbered that the tactical computer did not even bother calculating engagement odds. It simply classified the incoming flotilla as negligible threat. "Identify them," Zalos ordered. The sensor officer worked for a moment, then looked up with a trace of confusion. "They register as United Earth Expeditionary Force, Shock Group 7. They are human vessels, Fleet Commander." A murmur passed through the bridge crew. The Zael had never fought humans. They knew of them, of course. The galaxy was full of young species stumbling their way onto the interstellar stage. But humans had never been considered a military factor. They had no empire. They had no client species. Their fleet was small, their territory modest, their weapons unremarkable by galactic standards. Zalos dismissed the new arrivals with a wave of his hand. "They are irrelevant. Maintain blockade formation. Continue ground operations." Aboard the carrier EES Gallatin, Captain Nora Beckett stood at the tactical display and studied the Zael fleet with the focused calm of a surgeon examining a patient. She was 44 years old, average height, with short dark hair and a face that did not waste time on expressions it did not need. She had commanded the Gallatin for 3 years and Shock Group 7 for 2. In that time, she had led 11 combat operations. She had won all of them, though "won" was a word she used carefully. Winning, in her experience, always cost something. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Dale Sweeney, stood beside her. He was tall, thin, and had the kind of quiet that came from thinking 3 steps ahead at all times. He studied the same display and said what they were both thinking. 300 ships, 8 dreadnoughts, overlapping fields of fire across every orbital approach. "They have built a wall in space, Captain." Beckett nodded slowly. "It is a good formation. Tight, disciplined, designed to stop a fleet from getting through." "Can we get through?" "We are not going to try to get through their fleet, Dale. We are going to go through a hole that does not exist yet, and make it exist for about 6 minutes. She pulled up the lance formation on the display. a narrow, stacked column of ships designed for one purpose: to punch through a blockade at maximum speed and deliver ground forces before the enemy could react. It was not a subtle tactic. It was not a safe tactic. It was built on speed, violence, and the understanding that some of the ships in the column would not survive the run. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy knew about penetration tactics in theory. None of them used them the way humans did, because the math was terrifying. The lead ships in the lance would absorb the majority of enemy fire. Their job was to survive long enough to draw defensive attention and create a narrow corridor behind them. The carrier, protected in the center of the column, would use that corridor to launch drop pods at the planet's surface. The trailing ships would cover the withdrawal. The math said the lead ships had a 30% chance of survival. The math said the carrier had a 60% chance. The math said people would die. Beckett had run the numbers. She had accepted them. She opened a ship-wide channel. Her voice was even and clear, the kind of voice that made you listen, not because it was loud, but because it was steady. All hands, this is Captain Beckett. In 90 minutes, we will execute a lance penetration of the Xyle blockade over Verath Prime. Our mission is to deliver Shock Group 7's ground forces to the planet's surface to relieve Coalition troops who have been under siege for 13 days. The enemy fleet outnumbers us roughly 25-1. Our ships will take damage. Some of us will not come back from this. She paused, not for drama. She paused because she believed that when you told people they might die, you owed them a moment of silence before you told them why it was worth it. There are 6,000 Coalition soldiers on that planet. They have been fighting alone for almost 2 weeks. They called for help, and nobody came. We are going to be the ones who come. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. Stations in 60 minutes. Beckett out. She closed the channel and looked at Sweeney. Get the drop bays ready. I want pods loaded and troopers suited in 45 minutes. Sweeney nodded and left. Beckett turned back to the tactical display. 300 red icons surrounded the planet. 12 blue icons, her ships, formed up at the system's edge. Any sane commander would withdraw and call for a larger fleet. Beckett was perfectly sane. She simply understood something that the Xyle did not. The humans had not come to win a space battle. They had come to land soldiers on a planet. The fleet was just the delivery system. The real weapon was the 200 men and women sitting in the drop bay below her feet, checking their rifles and tightening their armor, and writing short messages to people they loved, just in case. She checked the clock. 90 minutes. In the drop bay, Sergeant First Class Danny Kowalski sat on a metal bench and ran a cleaning cloth over his rifle for the 3rd time. It did not need cleaning. It was a habit, something to keep his hands busy while his mind worked through the operation ahead. Around him, 200 shock troopers prepared for the drop in the way soldiers have always prepared. Some quiet, some talking too much, some checking their gear with obsessive precision, some staring at nothing. He had done this 9 times before. The fear never went away. You just learned to put it in a box and set it aside until later, if there was a later. His squad leader, Corporal Meg Harlan, dropped onto the bench beside him. She was 23, with a narrow face and steady hands, and the particular kind of calm that young soldiers sometimes had, not because they were brave, but because they had not yet learned all the things there were to be afraid of. "Sergeant, how bad is it going to be?" she asked. Kowalski looked at her. He could have lied. He could have told her it would be easy, that they would drop in and clean up and be back on the ship by dinner. But he did not believe in lying to soldiers. They deserved better than that. "It is going to be bad," he said. "The drop will be rough. The landing will be hot. The fighting after that will be close and ugly. People are going to get hurt, and some of them are not going to come home." Harlan absorbed this without flinching. And the people on the ground, the ones we are going to help, they have been holding for 13 days with no supplies, no support, and no hope. Until us. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her rifle and began checking it for the 4th time. Kowalski watched her and felt the old, familiar weight settle in his chest. It was not fear exactly. It was responsibility. Every one of these 200 soldiers was his to bring home, if he could, and his to lead well if he could not. They were encircled. Then Earth's shock troops landed. Part 3. The Drop. The Lance hit the Zale blockade at a speed that made every alien sensor operator in the fleet blink and check their instruments twice. 12 human ships, arranged in a tight spear-point column, came screaming out of the void at full military thrust. The lead ships, 2 frigates, the Casey and the Dunbar, were running so hot that their engines glowed white against the black of space. Behind them, packed in close formation, the rest of the flotilla followed, like an arrow fired from a bow that had been pulled too far back. Fleet Commander Zalos saw the formation on his display and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, confusion. Every species in the galaxy understood the concept of a blockade. You spread your ships out, you created overlapping fields of fire, and you made it impossible for anything to get through. The correct response to a blockade, if you were outnumbered, was to withdraw and return with a larger fleet. That was how war worked. That was how it had always worked. The humans were not withdrawing. They were accelerating. "They are on a direct approach vector," his tactical officer reported, and there was a note of disbelief in his voice. "Speed increasing. They appear to be targeting a narrow section of our formation between the 3rd and 4th patrol groups." "That section is covered by 46 ships," Zalos said. "Yes, Fleet Commander." Zalos stared at the display. 46 ships against 12, with the full weight of the fleet able to converge within minutes. The humans were flying into a wall of guns. It was not brave, it was insane. "All ships in the target sector, open fire," he ordered. Space lit up. Plasma bolts the size of ground vehicles slammed into her forward shields and peeled them away like paper in a storm. The ship shuddered, buckled, and kept going. Her captain, a young man named Pete Allison who had graduated from the Naval Academy only 4 years ago, gripped his armrests and shouted orders over the sound of his ship tearing itself apart. "Maintain speed. Maintain heading. Do not deviate." The Casey lasted 90 seconds longer than anyone had a right to expect. She drew the fire of 11 Zale warships, and every bolt that hit her was a bolt that did not hit the ships behind her. When her reactor finally gave out, and she broke apart in a flash of white light, she had opened a gap. Narrow, temporary, burning at the edges, but a gap. The Dunbar flew through the wreckage of the Casey and into the gap. She lasted longer. Her captain, Commander Rita Santos, was an old hand who knew how to angle her ship to spread damage across multiple hull sections. She took hits that would have killed a lesser ship, and kept pushing forward, her weapons firing back at everything in range, not to destroy the Zale ships, but to make them flinch, to make them shift their firing solutions for just a second, to buy just a little more time. Behind the Dunbar, the Gallatin surged forward. On the bridge, Beckett stood with her feet braced against the deck as the ship rocked under near-miss explosions. The tactical display was a nightmare of red and orange warnings. Hull breaches on 3 decks, portside armor failing, 2 weapon systems offline. A fire in the secondary engineering bay that damage control was fighting to contain. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the planet below, and the 6 minutes she needed to hold the lane open. "Drop bay status," she called. From deep in the ship's belly, Sweeney's voice came back, tight but controlled. "Pods loaded, troopers sealed. Ready, on your order, Captain." Beckett watched the range counter tick down. The Gallatin was taking fire now. Heavy fire, the kind that made the entire ship groan like a living thing in pain. A plasma bolt punched through the port hull and vaporized a storage compartment and everything in it. The lights flickered. Somewhere behind her, a console exploded in a shower of sparks, and a crew member screamed. "Launch the pods," Beckett said. In the drop bay, the world became noise and motion. 200 pods released from the Gallatin's belly in a sequence that took less than 4 seconds. Each pod was a sealed metal coffin barely large enough for one armored trooper, equipped with a heat shield, braking thrusters, and just enough guidance capability to hit a landing zone the size of a football field from orbital altitude. Danny Kowalski felt the kick of separation, and then the stomach-dropping sensation of freefall as his pod cleared the ship and began its descent toward Verath Prime. Through the tiny viewport in the pod's hull, he could see flashes of light. The battle still raging in orbit, ships firing, ships dying, the Gallatin taking hit after hit as it held position long enough for the last pods to clear. Then the atmosphere hit. The pod began to shake, not a gentle vibration, but a violent, teeth-rattling, bone-deep shaking that made it impossible to think about anything except holding on. The heat shield on the nose of the pod glowed orange, then red, then white. The temperature inside the pod climbed, despite the cooling systems. Sweat ran down Kowalski's face, inside his helmet. The altimeter on his display spun like a clock running backward at 100 times normal speed. Somewhere out there, Ziel anti-air batteries were firing. He could not see them, but he could feel the shock waves when their shots passed close. Sudden jolts that knocked the pod sideways and sent his heart into his throat. A pod somewhere to his left took a direct hit. He did not see it explode. He only saw the brief flash of light reflected on his viewport, and knew that someone he had been talking to an hour ago was gone. In their own pod, Meg Harlan was gripping the safety handles so hard her fingers ached inside her armored gloves. The shaking was worse than anything the training simulations had prepared her for. The noise was indescribable, a continuous roar of atmosphere tearing past the hull, mixed with the thud and crack of anti-air fire. Her heart was hammering so fast she could feel it in her ears. She did not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. She was 23 years old. She was falling through the sky of an alien planet in a metal box the size of a closet, and people were shooting at her from below. Fear was the only rational response. But her hands, when she checked her rifle one final time, were steady. She had trained for this. Not just the mechanics of it. Anyone could learn to fire a weapon and move in armor. But the mental part, the part where you were terrified and you did your job anyway. That was what made a shock trooper. Not the absence of fear, the presence of discipline. The altimeter hit 500 meters. The braking thrusters fired with a roar that slammed her down into her seat. The pod slowed, tilted, and then hit the ground with an impact that rattled every bone in her body. For a moment, there was silence. Real silence after hours of noise. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the sound of her own breathing inside her helmet. Then the pod's hatch blew open, and the world rushed in. Smoke, dust, the distant sound of gunfire, the smell of something burning. Harlan grabbed her rifle and climbed out into the dim light of Verath Prime's smoky dawn. She was standing in a flat, open area behind what appeared to be a Ziel supply depot. Crates and containers were stacked in neat rows around her. Ziel vehicles sat parked in lines. And everywhere, pod after pod was slamming into the ground, hatches blowing open, armored figures climbing out with weapons ready. Kowalski's pod had landed 40 meters to her right. He was already out, already moving, already on the radio. She could hear his voice in her earpiece, calm and clear despite everything. "All squads, this is Kowalski. We are on the ground. Form on your team leaders. Weapons hot. We are in the Ziel rear area, and they do not know we are here yet. That is going to change in about 60 seconds. So let us make the most of it. Around the landing zone, 200 shock troopers formed up with the speed of people who had rehearsed this 1,000 times. Squads found each other, team leaders checked their people, weapons were charged, and safeties were off. Private First Class Luis Vega jogged up to Harlan's position and dropped to a knee beside her. He was a quiet kid from New Mexico, 21 years old, with big hands and a nervous habit of touching his helmet strap. He looked at the Zale depot stretching out before them and let out a long, slow breath. "We actually made it," he said. "We made it to the ground," Harlan corrected him. "The hard part has not started yet." As if to prove her point, a Zale sentry on the far side of the depot spotted them and began shouting in alarm. The sound of it, high-pitched and sharp, cut through the smoky air like a blade. Kowalski's voice came over the radio one more time. "All units, weapons free. Let them know we are here." The first shots rang out across the depot, and the battle for Verith Prime entered a new chapter. They were encircled. Then Earth's shock troops landed. Part 4. The Breaking. The Zale rear echelon had never been attacked before. In 13 days of siege, not a single enemy shot had been fired in their direction. The supply depots, the communication relays, the reserve troop staging areas, the command posts, all of it sat behind the siege lines in what every Zale officer considered the safest ground on the planet. Troops moved freely. Vehicles drove without escort. Officers walked between buildings without guards. That ended in the first 30 seconds after Kowalski gave the order. 200 human shock troopers hit the Zale rear area like a hammer falling on glass. They moved fast, they moved hard, and they moved with a kind of controlled violence that the Zale had never encountered from any species. There was no warning barrage, no careful probing of defenses, no cautious advance. The humans simply attacked with everything they had, all at once, in half a dozen directions. Kowalski led his squad straight into the largest supply depot. They blew through the perimeter fence with breaching charges, and were inside before the Zale guards had finished reaching for their weapons. The fighting in the depot was close and fast, between stacked crates and parked vehicles, around corners and through narrow gaps, the kind of combat where you saw the enemy's face before you pulled the trigger. Kowalski's troopers cleared the depot in 8 minutes. When they were done, they set charges on every ammunition stockpile they could find and moved on. The explosions that followed were enormous. Columns of fire rose into the smoky sky, and the ground shook hard enough to knock soldiers off their feet a kilometer away. A Zale ammunition dump that had taken weeks to build and stock was gone in seconds. With it went the shells that would have fed the siege artillery for another week. Without those shells, the big guns would fall silent. Without the big guns, the coalition perimeter would stop shrinking. But Kowalski was not thinking about the big picture. He was thinking about the next objective, and the squad around him, and the fact that the Zale were waking up to what was happening. The surprise lasted maybe 10 minutes. After that, the Zale began to react. Reserve units that had been resting behind the lines grabbed their weapons and moved toward the sounds of fighting. Officers shouted orders. Anti-armor teams deployed to the roads. The Zale were not stupid, and they were not cowards. They were professional soldiers fighting on their own ground. And once the shock wore off, they began to hit back hard. A Zale quick reaction force caught one of the human squads in the open between two buildings and pinned them down with heavy weapons fire. The squad leader, a corporal named Tony Briggs, took a plasma bolt through his shoulder armor and went down. His second, a trooper named Katie Novak, dragged him behind a concrete barrier and took command of the squad without missing a beat. She directed return fire, called for support, and held the position for 6 minutes, until another squad flanked the Zale force and broke their line. That was the pattern. The Zale would react, concentrate their forces, and try to pin the humans down. The humans would adapt, shift positions, find a way around or through, and keep moving. It was not clean, it was not elegant. People were getting hurt on both sides, and the fighting was spreading across a wider and wider area, as both forces committed more troops. Meg Harlan's squad had been given one job: cut the main supply road that fed the Ziel's southern siege line. It was a wide, packed dirt highway that ran through a shallow valley between two low ridges, and every hour dozens of Ziel vehicles used it to move troops, ammunition, and equipment to the front. Cut that road, and the entire southern assault would starve. Harlan's squad reached the road without being spotted. They set demolition charges at a narrow point where the road crossed a drainage culvert, blew the charges, and dropped a 20-meter section of the highway into the ditch below. Vehicles coming from both directions skidded to a stop. Drivers climbed out and stared at the crater in confusion. Then Harlan's squad opened fire from the ridge above. The first counterattack came within 15 minutes. A Ziel infantry platoon advanced up the slope toward their position in a spread formation, firing as they moved. Harlan positioned her people along the ridge and directed their fire with short, clear commands. The Ziel assault was thrown back. They regrouped, brought up a heavy weapons team, and tried again. The second assault was worse. The heavy weapons team laid down suppressive fire that chewed up the ridgeline and forced the squad to keep their heads down while Ziel infantry closed the distance. Harlan could hear the bolts cracking overhead, could feel dirt and rock fragments pelting her armor. Beside her, Luis Vega was firing controlled bursts at the advancing figures, his face set in a tight grimace behind his visor. A plasma bolt hit the ground 2 meters from Vega, and the blast threw him sideways. Harlan saw him go down and felt her stomach drop. She scrambled to him through the dust and debris and found him conscious but hurt. The blast had torn through his left arm below the elbow. He was bleeding badly, despite the armor's emergency seal, and his face was white with shock. She grabbed him by his armor harness and dragged him into the deepest part of their position, behind a boulder that offered some protection from the fire. Then she went back to the firing line. The Ziel were close now, 50 meters and closing. Harlan could see them clearly, tall figures in dark armor moving between rocks and scrub. Her squad was down to 6 effective fighters, and the Ziel had at least 30 soldiers in the assault wave. She picked up Vega's rifle in addition to her own, and began firing both weapons in alternating bursts, shifting position after every few shots to make it harder for the Ziel to pin her down. It was not a technique for any manual. It was desperation made into action. For 4 minutes, she held that section of the line alone, firing, moving, firing again, until a relief element from another squad arrived at a run and added their guns to the defense. The Ziel assault broke. The survivors pulled back down the slope and did not try again. 3 kilometers to the north, inside the coalition perimeter, Commander Torvon heard the explosions. They were distant, muffled by the walls of the bunker, but unmistakable. Not incoming fire, these were behind the Ziel lines. He looked at Galen, who looked back at him with wide eyes. "What is that?" Galen asked. Torvon did not answer. He turned to the sensor station, where a Makari technician was studying readouts with growing confusion. "I am detecting multiple explosions in the Ziel rear area," the technician reported. "Their supply depots, their staging grounds, something is hitting them from behind." Lias called up from the communications room. "Commander, I am picking up radio traffic on an unknown frequency. It is encrypted, but the pattern matches the signal we received 2 days ago. The humans, they are on the ground." Before Torvon could respond, a new transmission cut through on an open channel. The voice was human, rough, slightly out of breath, but perfectly clear. "Coalition Garrison, this is Sergeant Kowalski, United Earth Shock Group 7. We are currently in the Ziel rear area making a mess of things. Recommend you push now. We will meet you in the middle." The command center went silent. Every officer, every technician, every soldier in that room stopped what they were doing and looked at Torvon. He could see it in their eyes, something that had been dead for days, flickering back to life. Hope. Torvon made his decision in less than 3 seconds. He knew what an opportunity looked like. And he knew that this one would not last. "All units, all sectors," he said, his voice carrying the hard edge of a commander who has made his final bet. "Advance. Push forward on all fronts. Everything we have, everything we can move, push it forward now." The coalition forces surged out of their defensive positions, like water breaking through a dam. Exhausted, battered, running low on everything, they attacked. Sylvani infantry charged across open ground they had been hiding behind for days. Droth heavy troopers smashed through weakened barricades. Polari scouts sprinted ahead, marking targets for the forces behind them. Makari armor, down to its last fuel reserves, rolled forward with guns blazing. The Xyl were caught between two forces. In front of them, the coalition garrison was attacking with a ferocity born of desperation. Behind them, 200 human shock troopers were tearing their supply lines and command structure to pieces. The Xyl were disciplined soldiers, but no army can fight effectively when it is being hit from 2 directions at once, and its ammunition supply has just been blown into the sky. Unit by unit, sector by sector, the Xyl siege lines began to crack. In orbit, Beckett watched the ground situation develop on her tactical display and saw her moment. The Xyl fleet commander, alarmed by the reports from the surface, was pulling ships out of the blockade to reposition. The wall of guns that had sealed the planet was developing gaps. "Second wave," Beckett ordered. "Get the dropships through now." Heavy transports loaded with vehicles, weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies launched from the surviving ships of the flotilla, and dove toward the planet through the holes in the Xyl formation. One was hit badly enough that it had to crash land near the starport rather than touch down properly. But most of them made it through, and the supplies they carried hit the ground like rain on parched earth. The siege of Verath Prime was breaking, and it was breaking because 200 soldiers from a small, young, unremarkable planet had dropped out of the sky and refused to let it hold. They were encircled. Then Earth's shock troops landed. Part 5, The Afterword. The fighting ended slowly, the way fires die. Not all at once, but in stages, flaring up here and there before fading into smoke and silence. By the time the sun of Verath Prime climbed above the horizon and cast its pale golden light across the starport, the Xyl had pulled back to secondary positions 30 kilometers away. Their siege lines were broken. Their supply depots were burning craters. Their communication network was in ruins. They were not defeated. The Xyl Dominion did not collapse from a single blow. But they had lost their grip on the starport, and everyone on both sides knew they would not get it back. The coalition perimeter was secure for the first time in 2 weeks. Commander Torvon walked through the starport grounds in the early morning light, stepping over rubble and spent ammunition casings and all the other debris that a battle leaves behind. The air smelled of smoke and ozone and something chemical that burned the back of his throat. Around him, coalition soldiers were doing what soldiers do after a fight. Sitting down, drinking water, staring at nothing, tending to wounds, looking for friends, trying not to think about the friends they would not find. He passed a Sylvani medic, treating a Quillari trooper whose face was burned. He passed a Makari crew, repairing a damaged vehicle, with whatever tools and parts they could scavenge. He passed a group of Droth soldiers, sitting in a circle, eating cold rations in silence. None of them looked up. They were too tired, but they were alive, and yesterday most of them had not expected to be. He found the humans near the eastern edge of the starport, in a cleared area between 2 damaged hangars. They had set up a field station. Nothing fancy, Just a few portable shelters, some equipment cases, and a makeshift medical tent where their wounded were being treated. The area was organized with a simple efficiency that Torvald recognized as the mark of professionals who had done this many times before. What struck him first was how ordinary they looked. He had seen them in their armor during the battle, large, menacing figures covered in plates of composite material, carrying weapons that seemed too big for most species. He had imagined them as giants, but now, with their helmets off and their armor partially removed, they were just people. They were smaller than his Sylvani soldiers, softer in the face. Some of them had hair the color of dry grass, others dark like volcanic rock. Their skin came in different shades, and their eyes were small compared to most galactic species. They did not look like the force that had just broken a siege that 300 alien warships had been unable to prevent. And yet, he spotted her before he spotted anyone else. Meg Harlan was sitting on a stack of ammunition crates near the medical tent, eating something from a foil packet with one hand while talking to Luis Vega with the other. Vega sat next to her with his left arm in a medical brace. The field surgeons had saved the arm, but it would be weeks before he could use it properly. He was laughing at something Harlan had said, and she was grinning back at him with the easy, careless smile of someone who was too young to fully understand what she had survived. Torvald stared at her. This was the soldier who had held a section of the ridgeline alone for 4 minutes against a full Zale assault. He had read the after-action reports that Kowalski had filed. He knew what she had done. She looked like a child to him. On his homeworld she would not have been old enough to serve. She had fought like nothing he had ever seen. He turned away from her and saw Kowalski approaching. The sergeant walked with the heavy, careful steps of a man who was bruised everywhere, but not willing to show it. His face was tired, but his eyes were clear, and he carried himself with the straightforward confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was good at. Kowalski stopped in front of Torvald and saluted, a crisp, formal gesture where the right hand came up to the forehead and then dropped back to the side. Torvald did not fully understand the gesture, but he recognized it as something offered with respect, and he returned it with a Sylvani salute of his own, a closed fist placed over the chest. They looked at each other for a moment. Two soldiers from different worlds, different species, different everything, connected by the simple fact that they had both survived the same terrible night. "Your people fought well," Torvald said through his translator. The words felt insufficient, like trying to describe a storm by talking about the rain. "So did yours," Kowalski replied. 13 days with no support. That is impressive by any standard, Commander." Torvald shook his head slowly. "We were surviving. Your people changed the outcome." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. In his experience, the question behind the question mattered more than the question itself. "I want to understand something, Sergeant. Why did you come?" Kowalski tilted his head slightly. "You sent a distress call. I sent it to everyone, to every species, every fleet, every government that might hear it. No one else answered. The Sylvani home fleet is 12 days away. The Droth Expeditionary Force is engaged in another system. The Kolari sent us a message expressing sympathy and regret. The Makari High Command told us to hold as long as possible and prepare for evacuation, knowing there would be no evacuation." He let that settle before continuing. "You had no treaty with us, no obligation, no strategic interest in this planet. Your species has never fought in this sector before. You came a very long way, into a fight that was not yours, against an enemy that outnumbered you beyond reason. I am asking you why." Kowalski was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he seemed to be considering how to explain something that to him required no explanation at all. It was like being asked why you breathed. You called for help, he said finally. We were close enough to answer. Torvald studied the human's face. There was no performance in it. No politics. No calculation of advantage or repayment. The man meant exactly what he said, and nothing more, and nothing less. In 40 years of military service, Torvald had served alongside a dozen species. He had learned that every species fought for something: territory, resources, pride, survival, ideology. There was always a reason, always an angle, always something behind the flag. He had accepted this as the nature of war and the nature of the species that waged it. He was looking at something different now. He did not fully understand it yet, but he filed it away in the part of his mind that stored things that mattered. How many shock troopers does Earth have? He asked. Kowalski thought about it for a moment, the way a person thinks about a question they have never been asked before and want to answer honestly. Enough, he said. The answer told him everything he needed to know, and everything he was afraid of, and everything he was grateful for, all at the same time. In orbit, aboard the battered Gallatin, Nora Beckett sat alone in her quarters and stared at a list of names on her screen. 14 dead from the fleet, 31 dead on the ground. 45 names. 45 people who had been alive yesterday and were not alive today because she had given the order that put them in harm's way. She read each name. She always did. It was not a duty she enjoyed. It was a duty she refused to delegate. Pete Allison, captain of the Casey, 28 years old. He had a sister in Colorado who painted landscapes and a dog named Biscuit that he talked about constantly. His ship had been the first through the gap. He had held course until there was nothing left to hold. Beckett closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and continued reading. Dale Sweeney found her an hour later. He stood in the doorway of her quarters and waited until she looked up. Dry dock estimates say 6 months for the Gallatin, he said. The other ships are in varying condition. We can hold position here for now, but we will need a relief force within the week. Beckett nodded. I will send the request. Sweeney hesitated. He was not a man who hesitated often, so when he did, it meant he was about to say something personal, which he also did not do often. Do you think Command will consider this a success? He asked. Beckett looked past him, through the viewport behind his shoulder. Verath Prime hung in the darkness below them, battered and scarred but intact. She could see the lights of the starport coming back online, small points of light blinking into existence one by one, like a heartbeat returning after it had stopped. Medical shuttles were lifting off from the surface. Supply convoys were beginning to move. 6,000 Coalition soldiers were alive who should have been dead. She turned back to Sweeney. They were surrounded, she said. Now they are not. That is enough. Sweeney accepted this the way he accepted most things Beckett said, with a small nod and no further comment. He left her to her names. 3 levels below the command center of the Coalition bunker, Lee sat at her communications console for the last time before the shift change. The fighting was over. The immediate crisis had passed. But she had one more task. The after-action report that Coalition Command required from every engagement. She typed carefully, describing the battle in the dry, factual language that military reports demanded. Force compositions, casualty figures, timeline of events, tactical assessments. She was thorough and precise, because that was her nature, and because the report would be read by people who had not been here and needed to understand what had happened. She reached the section on Allied forces and paused. The Galactic intelligence file on humans was still open on her secondary screen. She had pulled it up days ago when the first signal arrived. The entry was short and dismissive. Recently spacefaring, technologically moderate, diplomatically unremarkable, limited military capability, no significant fleet assets, rated as a minor regional presence with limited power projection capacity. Leas read it twice, Then she selected the entire passage and deleted it. She sat for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, thinking about what she had seen. She thought about the ships that had flown into a wall of fire and kept going. She thought about the pods falling through the sky. She thought about the sound of Kowalski's voice on the radio, calm, steady, certain, while the world exploded around him. She thought about the young woman on the ridge, holding the line with 2 rifles and nothing but stubbornness. She began to type. Supplemental assessment, filed by Communications Officer Lees, Quillari Coalition Forces, Verath Prime Garrison. Classification, priority distribution to all Coalition military commands. She paused again. Then she wrote the words that would eventually be copied, translated, distributed, debated, and quoted across 100 worlds and 1,000 intelligence briefings. The words that would become the first real assessment the galaxy ever had of what humanity was capable of when someone asked for help. Do not underestimate the humans. When they come for you, they come with everything. And when they come for their friends, they come even harder. She read it back to herself. It was not the dry, careful language of a military report. It was something else. It was a warning, and a compliment, and a truth that she had earned the right to speak, because she had watched it happen. She submitted the report and leaned back in her chair. Outside, through the thick walls of the bunker, she could hear the sounds of the starport coming back to life. Engines starting, people talking, the ordinary, beautiful noise of a place that had been given a second chance. Somewhere among those sounds, she was sure, she could hear the humans laughing,